Welcome to a special episode of One Work, 5 Questions, which today will be One Historian, 5 Questions. And I'd like for you to welcome Dr. M. Andrew Holowchak as our historian.
How are you doing today? We're doing this at night. This is a little bit new.
Yes, how fun. We get to spend a Friday evening talking about history. What better way to spend your time, right?
Exactly. I can't think of anything better I'd like to do.
Well, first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Holowchak's credentials. He's a PhD, retired professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, and Ohio University. He is editor of Journal of Thomas Jefferson and His Time, and author-editor of over 50 books and over 200 published essays on topics such as ethics, ancient philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, and critical thinking. His current research is on Thomas Jefferson. He is acknowledged by many scholars to be the world's foremost authority and has published over 100 essays and 20 books on Jefferson. Like Jefferson, he has a passion for putting up and pulling down, but his putting up and pulling down is not architectural, but done on a landscape or in a garden. He also enjoys lifting weights, bike riding, conferencing, and talking about Thomas Jefferson. So today, I'd like to tell you the importance of why we're doing this video. We've had many discussions about the importance of history and historiography, and we want everyone to understand the obligations and responsibilities of historians and their notion of history and historiography. That is important because historians shape our understanding of the past so that we can prepare for, or at least hope for, a better future. With this in mind, I will ask professional historian and philosopher, Dr. M. Andrew Holowchak, 5 questions to aid us in the understanding of the discipline of history, practiced today and ago. Okay, are you ready for question number 1?
I guess so. Let's fire.
Okay, what is a historian?
Well, yeah, you initially gave me a question and asked for what history is and what's a historian. I thought we could collapse them into one because to answer one, and I prepared for the audience a very brief sort of scheme here. Talks about historiography is generally conceded by historians to be the history of history. And there's no one accepted scheme of how the history of history plays out, but there's one that's accepted increasingly by a lot of people. And it goes something like this, that at some point there was a pre-modern phase, which is prior to the Enlightenment, when we had the intellectual revolution. There was the modern stage. The modern stage might roughly run from the Enlightenment times to the early 1960s. And then right now there is the postmodern stage, which began sometime in the 1960s and continues today. Okay. Now, to answer the question what history is, we have to delve into historiography, the history of history. Now, roughly speaking, if we follow the scheme, roughly the pre-modern time is pre-enlightenment. It's mythopoeic. It deals with the creation of myths. I should add that a myth in ancient times wasn't a bad word. It comes from the Greek word mythos, which meant a story passed down from mouth to mouth, which has nothing, no implication for its truth or falsity. It's a story passed down in many of the stories. So you get stories like the ones Hesiod tells, the ones Homer tells in his 2 epics. You get Herodotus, who gives us the Historia in Greek, the first real Western account of history, talking about the Greeks and the Persian War. And in his account, there have like Homer, there's the intervention of the gods and so forth. But then later than Herodotus, you get the Greek Thucydides. And Thucydides attempted to demythologize, take the false stuff out of history. Now, he focused for the most part on not history too far away. He was interested in apprising us of the Peloponnesian War and things like that. But so he was interested in, you know, he wrote, what I am trying to do, I do not for applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time. And in some sense, what he's trying to do is bring in history as a pursuit worth doing, something that can get us at what's going on in the past. So, you know, we get into Roman historians like Livy and Tacitus and Plutarch, and the idea here to cover this briefly, we have mythical stories in the modern sense. We have religious, political intent in these accounts. We have free use of narrative. So the idea here in this little sketch is what goes on in the pre-modern era is that different people in different countries and different cultures are telling their stories. They're given different sorts of history, so there's no sort of method to it. Now, with the modern, which I call with the Enlightenment times, up until the early 1960s, that's just a random number I'm throwing off. It's rough, I think. Some historians would say we come into the modern, which is a reconstructive. I don't use reconstructive in the sense that it's often used today, but namely, it's reconstructive in the sense that there is an objective world out there, and we can know something about it. So the idea is when we delve into the past, we look at older texts, we look at archaeological evidence and so forth. We try to reconstruct what actually happened at the time. Now, of course, there are problems with that view, but it seems to be a reasonable view. There comes to be the greatest adherent of this modern approach is Leopold von Ranke, who was a German scholar who in the late 1800s, he was born and he flourished in the 19th century, excuse me, not the 1900s. He brought into a sort of method for historians that history was for professionals, and he was following, in a sense, sort of scientific method that was flourishing at the time, that Francis Bacon introduced, and Isaac Newton and Galileo Galilei, a blend of rationalism and empiricism. We're studying the world. So as I have, as you see, in terms of the modern reconstructive, we have analysis, fact-finding, critical interaction, rigor, documentation, comprehensiveness, eschewal of presentism. Presentism is the thing that goes on oftentimes in postmodernists thought that we're only interested in the past to help us with present concerns, so we can use the problems of the present to understand the past. You see the race issue is employed, even though racism wasn't a concept a few hundred years ago. We talk about the racism of the founding fathers and all people at that time. Anybody who owned a slave was a racist. That made even blacks who owned slaves racist. But the idea is it's a scientific method. There's a method to science. Not anyone, professionalism, not anyone can become a scientist. So, you follow that. There's this sense of there's an objective world out there, and what the history tries to do is the same thing what an archaeologist does, is I delve into the past and try to reconstruct it, try to know as much as I can about that. Now, does that mean, if I think that that's possible, does that mean I can know everything about a certain event or certain person? Of course not. Events themselves are human constructions. We talk of the Revolutionary War. When did it start? When did it end? Nobody really knows or agrees. So there's a sense in which there's an arbitrariness to that. But there's no arbitrariness to saying that there was a Revolutionary War. So that means what we do is we try to have a sort of collision ideas from historians to try to have a greater understanding. So this notion of critical analysis of fact-finding, professionalism. Not everybody can do history. You need to be trained in it. There are methods and so forth. Historians entertain a hypothesis. They seek out data and evidence, facts consistent with that hypothesis. If we find evidence inconsistent with hypothesis, right, it challenges the hypothesis. And in some sense, we might have to throw the hypothesis away, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Now we get to the third stage, which historians call the postmodernist stage. It really, if we want to sum it, it's just putting a tilde. In logic, a tilde is that wavy sign that means whatever you just said, I deny it, it's false. Everything that happened in the Rankian reconstructive modern phase is just wrong. Instead of objectivity, we have subjectivity. We have deconstruction instead of reconstruction. I'll explain what I mean by deconstruction in a bit. There is no possibility of knowledge, no big picture. We have a democratic notion of history in terms of that. We're opening history up to anybody who can practice history. You can post something on Facebook, you're a historian. You can you can just be a maven of history and write a book and self-publish it. And
right, you know, as we see today with journalists are now calling themselves doing the work of a historian.
Well, Cokie Roberts is a historian now. Of course, she was a very good journalist in her time too. So, yeah. So I mean, you know, postmodernism. It's and we need to say something about this to understand where the hell we're at. There is this disavowal of method. It's an attack on Westernism and Western methods. In fact, that there's a method to science. You get people like Foucault talking about Western power and Western oppression. We have that, you know, that's been plaguing our country. The whole notion that if you're white, you're part of Western Europe, that sort of culture, you're part of that Enlightenment culture. You're bringing in your science, which tells us nothing. Science is a bad thing. It's part of white person oppression. Nietzsche, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche brings in, he's probably the first person who brings in the postmodern era, at least most philosophers think. He talks of a genealogical approach. And by that, he means if we can talk about how something came about, talk about belief in God. If we can come back and find a point in human history where everybody started believing in God or believed in one God, then we can understand that there was a provenance, a beginning to that, and there was a creation. This is something that was created in human culture, and in some sense, we destroyed that. We have other people, Derrida, who gives us the notion of deconstruction. This is a very important point. When I read a text, and Derrida had something he said in translation, he said, there's nothing beyond the text. What the hell did he mean by what he meant by that is that there's a text. And when I read it, I get something out of it. When you read it, you get something else. Right. If I say I have a cigar in my hand, well, we might say, well, I know what a cigar is. Yeah, I sort of got that. But for you, you might think cigars are really odious, disgusting things, smelly things, cancer-causing things. So you associate that with something bad, and you associate the smoker as someone who is bad. Or you might, if you're a little wacky, think a cigar is just something for putting in a litter box or something. I don't know. But the idea is that they're responding to the notion that we can know things, we can know the past, saying the past is the past. It's not recoverable. It's in the past. So all we can do, say if I'm reading Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, it was written over 200 years ago. And the meaning of the terms the meaning of certain terms were different at the time. We can't get back to that time, so we can't understand what he meant by independence, by by equality and other terms that he used, by revolution. It's impossible. So what we do, Derrida just thinks, is that I have my own subjectivity. I have my own life experiences, and everything that I've experienced colors the way I read things. My concept of tree is going to be radically different from yours. And that's even, and the problem is even more pronounced when we go back to early texts, right? We can't access the climate, intellectual climate of the time. We can't even understand our own intellectual climate.
Right.
And it gets worse when they're trying to understand other cultures. So we go from radical, a possibility of radical objectivity to this notion of radical subjectivity. And then Foucault adds something that's very powerful to repeat, to iterate, this notion of everything in the West is bad because it's a sign of power. Western science, objectivity, facts, analysis, critical interaction is a power thing of the West, and we must respond to that. So so in a nutshell, for the postmodernist, there is no robust sense of history. Is not about anything in particular. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. So would you say that these are the three different types of historians?
No, I think there are an indefinitely large number of historians. I'm trying to find a quote from you. Wonderful. Is it in Becker's? There was in the 1930s a movement, the progressives that we have today. We have today's democratic progressives, but these were historical progressives. And Carl Becker, and he's writing Every Man His Own Historian. He writes in 1932, every generation, our own included, must inevitably understand the past and anticipate the future in light of its own restricted experience, presentism, right? In other words, we're interpreting the past in terms of our own experience, must inevitably play on the dead whatever tricks it finds necessary for its own peace of mind. So history for him, there's nothing objective about it.
Right.
We construct it for our own uses. We play tricks on the dead, he says, for our own peace of mind. So history, as historians are writing it, tells us nothing about the past. We're playing tricks on the dead, he says. I just love the quote because it's so unbelievable inane, and why it should be appealing to so many historians is certainly something much beyond me. I'm giving you a tripartite, a three-part model that's attractive to a lot of historians. I think it's a horrible model because you can't really compartmentalize what's going on. I, for example, am in the Leopold von Rankian view of doing the history as an objective discipline, their methods, and I think most historians that really practice out there believe that, at least their actions are consistent with that, even if they profess to be postmodern. Right?
Another part of what is a historian is what makes a lay historian different from a professional historian.
Go back to von Ranke, training. You are yourself in a graduate program in history, are you not?
Yes.
And you are, as you told me, that these questions here are part of an exercise that you're doing. I think it's a very good exercise that your professor gave you because you talked to a historian. I suspect that other students of yours who will interview another historian will get different answers, answers radically different from mine. And that itself, I think, is sort of revealing. But the whole notion, according to the postmodernists, that anybody can be, what does Becker say? Every man his own historian. You're an historian. I'm an historian. And, why can't my dog be an historian?
Jeffy can be a historian.
Yeah, but you understand how silly this is. Yeah. If there's no method, then anybody can be an historian. Anybody can say things that are historically illuminating at some point.
Right.
But that doesn't make someone a historian. It takes training. It takes learning how to write a thesis, how to thread that thesis through a text, how to be consistent with that thesis, how to keep things out of a text if it's not relevant, even if it's, cool. And that involves integrity. If you really believe that we can reconstruct the past to some extent. We're not going to create narratives that tells us exactly what happened, but we can get a very good sense of, say, who Thomas Jefferson was. I think I have a very fine understanding of the mind of Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
Very fine understanding.
I believe you do.
I hope I do.
Question number 2. What type of history do you practice, and how did you come to focus on Thomas Jefferson?
I don't like the question from the sense that I don't practice a type of history. I think I practice history properly construed. History is not a normative discipline. What does normative mean? It does not deal with the way the world ought to be. I do not interact with the past because I'm concerned about solving potential problems today. The historian's role is descriptive. I'm trying to tell stories, veridical stories, insofar as I can do that, about who Thomas Jefferson was, about what the Declaration was, who was John Hancock, things like that. Now, these are difficult enough to do. But to think that there are many different types of history, and in some sense there are different types, but I think these are all subsumable under the von Rankian rubric of history as an objective pursuit, right? So I'm a traditionalist. I'm a scientist. I think history is about putting forth a thesis and being consistent, and it's about marshaling facts. And that said, it's not only marshaling facts, it's also accommodating inconsistent evidence. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yes, I believe I do.
You have a hypothesis, and then there are certain facts that are not, you can't accommodate. They're inconsistent. So why is your thesis still a good thesis if you have this incommodious evidence? A historian has to show why that thesis is still the best thing out there until something better comes up. Or can I accommodate that thesis to the incommodious or inconsistent evidence to show that the evidence really not inconsistent? So I don't think I practice any type of history, but I practice history done rightly. So I said, according to me, history is about the past. It deals with facts. We construct narratives for the most part. That's not the whole of history, because sometimes a historian can just be marshaling factual information in a database or in a collection, in a book, used later by the historians. But I want to say, if, think about partitioning. Here I'm going to make a philosophical point. And this is, I add to you that I enjoy, in my time away from Jefferson, I do read historiography and philosophy of history. And I'm going to make a philosophical point. Because if we're going to have a history of history, and in that history of history, hope readers or listeners will follow this. If we're going to distinguish between a pre-modern, a modern, and a postmodern period, with three, at least the last two have distinct methods. One is objectivity, the other is subjectivity, so anything goes. And the second one, not anything goes. You have to be practiced and well studied in a certain method to be a historian. How do we know that there are three different periods? In what sort of method have we used to disclose this fact of three periods? In other words, the claim that history has three epochs must be a claim made from either postmodernist frame of reference, in which case the claim is vacuous, it makes no sense, or if it's made from the scientific progressive model. And another thing to say about these three periods is, are they progressive? What do I mean by that? When we go from pre-modern to modern, there seems to be a sort of progress that from adopting a certain method, from sort of helter-skelter approaches prior to the Enlightenment. And then when we get to, what does postmodern mean? Well, we know what modern means. It's objective approaches, but postmodern means we're beyond modern. That has a certain normativity. And what I mean by that, again, there's a certain we've made progress. We've realized this whole belief that history can reconstruct the past is bogus.
Mm.
No method to history. Historians just, and in the words of Becker again, we play tricks on the dead for our own peace of mind. The historian is no better than the novelist. There's nothing worth doing. In which case I add the following. Why would I be interested in writing a history, quote unquote, to learn about history? What does the historian give us that a novelist does, that a poet doesn't give us? And if you're a postmodernist, the answer can only be nothing. So what's the point of reading postmodernist history? Is it, as the postmodernists think, it's an advance over modern. It's post. We've learned something. What is it have we learned? That there's nothing to history? And again, this may be a little esoteric for people. If there's nothing to history, isn't that something we learned? And the postmodernists, if there's nothing to history, then the claim there's nothing to history is empty too. The postmodernist just hoist on its own petard. It's a vacuous claim that historians today could find it such an appealing thing. Boggles my flipping mind. I'm astonished that rational, well, of course they say there's no rationality, that men and women could find this appealing. This is something if you take philosophy 101, you'll talk about objectivity, subjectivity, why historians today think that this is something so exciting, right? Because they can craft. Anyways, that's my answer. So you can tell I have a very definite stance on that.
How did you come to focus on Thomas Jefferson?
Not a long story. I was interested in moving away from ancient philosophers, ancient scientists. That was my area of specialization at University of Pittsburgh. And my brother was always a sort of history maven, and I thought maybe he and I could work on a project, and I know he liked American history. A little I know that Thomas Jefferson was not one of his favorites. He was sort of like the John Adams and Theodore Roosevelt tough guys. And so I asked him if he wanted to work on it. He thought about it after a while. He sort of declined. And while he was in the act of declination, I already had a book done and was working on other essays. And well on my way to doing Thomas Jefferson, I found, and to be quite honest, I didn't know very much about Jefferson at the time. And I thought he was a pretty fascinating person. So I got here. I'm doing this. I love this guy. There is a large amount of philosophical content in his writing that needs to be fleshed out. And who better to do it than someone who's principally trained as a philosopher?
Right. Oh, perfect. Okay, question number 3. How do you determine what to include in and what to exclude from your historical analysis?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer that doesn't sound very von Frankian, because as I come to do things more, you want to think you start like scientists. People think scientists start with a hypothesis. Acetaminophen does this and this and this, and then they test things. And sometimes during the whole process of participating in the act of science, you find something you didn't expect to find, so you abandon your thesis and you do something else more interesting. So when I start a book, I told you one of the books I want to write right now is a book on Jefferson and war. I read something about a letter where he called the American Revolution the Holy War. Use of that appropriation of the term Holy War intrigued me. And, why was it a holy war? And again, I keep going back to Jefferson's Conception of Liberty. So I thought, there's only been one book written on Jefferson. It was a decent book, a short book on Jefferson and war. And, it was written in the 50s, and I read it not too long. It wasn't bad. And I thought, well, what if I really fleshed out Jefferson on war, just and unjust, because he had more than anybody else at his time, other than people like Immanuel Kant, the notion that, war, it's disgusting that we have to go to war. Nobody ever wins, but there are times that nations have to go to war. Just like at times that individuals they might have to try to kill somebody because that person's trying to kill someone in the family or whatever. So it's unfortunate no one wins, but there are times when you have to go to war. So what makes a war just and unjust in the mind of Jefferson? So, to answer the question, I think I've strayed a little bit, but you craft a thesis.
A little bit.
Yeah, that's how I write, unfortunately. The point I'm trying to make is that at times when you start, imagine this book I have on Jefferson and war, and I promise you the finished product will have nothing to do, but will be nothing like what I just told you. I will have refined it, changed, and tweaked things, and thinking I've really found some things that are really different. The idea is it's not unlike a work of art, writing a poem or making a painting. You begin a painting by a stroke of a brush with a certain color, maybe with your palette knife or your brush. And you might sketch something first on there, and then you fill it in with paints, oil paints, for example, or acrylics. And each stroke of the brush or touch of the palette, whatever you're using, touch of your finger, sort of determines what you can do thereafter. So you're constrained by that. At some point, you might say, hell with this and throw it away and start again. You can do that. Or I'm just going to scrape someone's start. But in some sense, when you start, what you've written sort of determines what you can do thereafter. But I would say that, when you're writing good history, you do settle on a thesis. You do exclude. I found other historians making this mistake so many times. They find something interesting en route to writing the book on a particular topic. Has nothing to do. Say I'm writing on Jefferson and war. Has nothing to do with Jefferson and war, but Jefferson's relationship, say, with his younger brother. And no one's ever talked about that. I don't know what to do with it. So I find a way to slip it into the book.
Right.
You can't do that. The book is not about his younger brother. And I've read some really good historians that do that at times. That one person, there's a friend of mine who wrote a book, I won't mention any names. And I said, well, why did you, I was the reader for it. I said, you go off like an 8-page tangent here. I said, was this like, I asked him personally, I said, was this an essay you wrote independently and it didn't get published, so you want to throw it in? You threw it in the book? He goes, yeah, how'd you know that? Because it reads that way.
Yeah.
So you have to be constrained logically by the thesis and the topic. Every chapter should be a sort of a thread in the argument that shows the reader where you're going. So you exclude things that might be interesting but irrelevant. You include, and I should say, if I find, we talked about incommodious evidence. If I find things that don't agree with my thesis, this is what a lot of historians do. What do you think a lot of historians do? If I find something that doesn't really jive with my thesis, what do I do with it?
I'm guessing they throw it away.
Yes, let's not look at it. Well, that's, Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings. There's so much evidence that suggests there's no relationship. Monticello sweeps it under the rug. Yeah, it's not important. We're not, we don't have to address that. You do. If there's something wrong, if there's evidence that creates problems for your thesis, I have to address that and be honest. So integrity, ingenuousness. I have to say, here's something that doesn't fit so well with my thesis, and I'm going to try to explain it away. Or if not, I'm just going to leave it for readers to ponder. And it may be that my thesis is wrong. It needs to be included. So I hope readers will understand that. So integrity is important.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of that as a student. Historians including information in an essay on one topic, but including irrelevant information in the essay. to make the person look bad. And that's why I took a liking to your work, because you didn't do that. You stayed focused on the topic and gave factual information that could be with primary source documents. And you didn't seem to have a motive.
Well, you can't do that. I mean, we talked to this personally before, and as everybody has certain biases. I concede that to the postmodernist tradition. Postmodernist traditions say, the biases make objective history impossible. Well, it's bullshit. It doesn't make it impossible, it makes it difficult. But there is a way of putting aside your biases when you start to write. You have to, it's not perfectly done, but you can, to a large extent, say, hey, forget all this stuff. Let's just figure out, let's look at the evidence for and against and try to see what works. I might look at the evidence and then construct the thesis by appeal to the evidence. I might have a thesis constructed in advance and then look for evidence for it and evidence against it and see whether the thesis holds up. Do I have to change my mind? So you have to appeal to evidence, right? That's a very, very important thing. You can't cherry pick. You can't start with a thesis, look for consistent evidence, and then ignore inconsistent evidence. That's not how history is done. If history is going to help us understand the past.
Right.
So historians have to be dispassionate, disinterested. Disinterested does not mean uninterested. Uninterested means I have no concern in it. Disinterested means I am interested in it, but I don't let my emotions.
You're not emotionally tied to it.
No, it's like a surgeon. A surgeon could not be a good surgeon if she got emotional when she's trying to replace someone's heart or kidney or something.
Right, and that's what I'm finding as a student. A lot of the essays that I read that are required reading are written by historians who have a specific agenda, and there's a lot of opinions based on their feelings included in the work, and that's
feelings don't belong there, do they?
Right.
Your opinions don't belong there.
No.
Opinions are for politicians. Historians are people who recreate the past insofar as they can do that, and there's no agenda. There shouldn't be I can have an agenda. I can write on Thomas Jefferson because I think, for example, the accusations he was a racist are false, and then try to show that that thesis is false. But what if I come across some evidence that suggests that my thesis is wrong? I have to be honest enough to embrace that and think, okay, well, wait a minute, let me rethink what I'm doing. Historians say they don't care about that. They're politics driven. Go back to Foucault. If we think that everything that happened in Enlightenment Europe was about white power, how whites were trying to get power, and part of that is true, right? I mean, we did go into North America and steal lands away from Native Americans. There were slaves, but there were white slaves brought in first, and black slaves. But slavery's been practiced for millennia and still practiced in parts of the earth. Power is not endemic just to white culture. Power is something that all people practice everywhere, even in these third world countries, right, that are so oppressed. People strive for power everywhere. That's something in the nature of people. It's not, there was so much wonderful stuff that happened in Enlightenment times that people want to sweep under the rug. Vaccines for yellow fever, the knowledge, Newton given us the law of gravitation, universal law, 3 laws of motion, Galileo's law of falling bodies, Boyle's pressure in gas, ideal gas law, and I can go on and on. It's, inventions that made farming easier, electricity, Franklin, go on and on and on. And we want to, we talked to this before, if there's nothing to this, if everything is just this white man's oppression and there's nothing to science, why the hell do you go to a doctor when you're sick?
Right.
Why not talk to your neighbor or talk to the bartender? Because there's a method that the scientist, that the doctor uses. It's not infallible. but it's a lot better. He or she's in a better
Right.
position to help you, right? So people who practice postmodernist historiography are not consistent with what they do. They write historical documents, they footnote, they look at primary evidence. You know, when you ask them what does this all mean, they say, well, it really doesn't mean anything. They don't believe that. So I think it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, to use a very technical term.
Question number 4, how do you stay current on the latest research and development in your field?
Well, if I write on Thomas Jefferson, and as you said, some people think I'm the world's foremost authority. It's nice to hear that. You know the people who are the best in the business, and you read the stuff that they're writing. You stay abreast by looking at search engines for in the better periodicals. You go to a search engine, you type in Thomas Jefferson, and you find out what's there. You look at the periodical, you read the abstract, and is this worth reading? A lot of the times, unfortunately, you find that a lot of the stuff is really not worth reading. Sometimes you read it anyway. I read a wonderful paper. Well, can't say I read it. I got through the first 3 pages or so. It was written by Irene Cheng, who was writing from obviously the postmodernist slant, and argued, have a lawsuit tomorrow from Irene. Holowchak said, yeah. She wrote this wonderful paper that said, we know Jefferson was a racist. We can see it in his architectural designs. He used octagons and grids. Any sure proof of someone's racism is the use of octagons, 8-sided figures in architecture. To me, that's smacks of racism more, and of course, grids. Descartes, obviously, with the Cartesian coordinate system with the X, Y, and Z axis for geometrical method, was the greatest racist because of the grids. And Newton, of course, used a similar schema to postulate that there was a center of space and they were 3 dimensions. Racists proves it using geometry, right? Only a racist would study geometry and employ architecture.
Yeah, I think I did hear that math is racist over the past couple of years. Okay,
let's try getting along without it. And I don't care what your skin color is. If you're green, and if you are a culture, if your skin color is green and you have a culture somewhere and you want to thrive without mathematics, you ain't going anywhere.
Yes, we need it for everything, even cooking.
Absolutely. Well, the way you cook, not the way I cook. That's why my cooking is, because I do proportion things. I sort of like throw this in and that.
Question number 5. Do you recognize any new historical trends, and where is history heading?
To the shitter. And I say that, and it's
the wrong major.
Well, yeah, it's what I do too. But yeah, I'm trying to fight this. So the whole notion of postmodernism, it's almost universally accepted by historians as something we've passed beyond modernism. Do people actually study what postmodernism is and understand what it means? It means everything we're writing is nonsense. That's what it means. There's nothing to history. And if that's really where we're at, then we can do anything we want. We can use, we're talking about Foucault and power struggles. We can use history for our own personal power struggles.
Right.
And what postmodernists are doing, they say, because of the modernist approach was too restrictive. We didn't talk about race, minorities, racial minorities like Asian Americans or African Americans or Native Americans. That's right. But there's nothing in the fabric of the modernist perspective on history, the objective approach that prohibits you from doing that. If you really think that there's a truth out there, why you can write on gays and lesbians if you want, that's fine. And there's a market for that to some extent. Sort of what limits you from what you can write is in effect if you do it the right way and you believe there's a method, is, potential audience. And that doesn't need to bother you too. You could say, well, I really don't care if many people read this, but I'm going to write it because I think it's going to be an important book.
Right.
So there's nothing prohibitive of writing in the modernist sense of sort of marginalized figures of gays or lesbians, marginalized races. That's all within the framework of modernism. And I think people have been doing that since the 60s.
Yeah.
And the people in the modernist tradition have been talking about racial equality and things. And, but the idea is we don't want to be political when we do that. Let's just describe situations of inequality descriptively. And people can draw their own inferences that this was not right. And we need, that's what we're doing politics. Politics feeds on history, but history is not normative. Politics is. Historians give us, insofar as they can, the facts and narratives that are built on facts. And here, what's important is when history is done the right way, there is a collision of ideas. Someone reads something I wrote and says, well, I like the book, but Holowchak got X, Y, and Z wrong. And I'm going to show you why, and you argue. And then Holowchak reads and say, yeah, I got X, Y, and Z wrong. Is someone going to rectify my mistake, or will I come back and rectify my own mistake? And I always say, and I want listeners to understand this, I would rather be relevant than right. And when you hear that, what the hell does that mean? History is about objectivity. You're talking about being relevant than right. Well, what I mean by that, when you do history the right way, if I'm trying to figure out what was the cause of the Civil War, it's so darned complicated. Why did Putin invade Ukraine? We were talking about that another time. The causal factors could be horribly complex, and the historian's job is to try to tease them out, given the available evidence. And oftentimes there is access to that available evidence. So, the idea is to try to tease out the relevant evidence as far as we can and construct a picture that political figures or other figures can use to make the world a better world for the next day.
Yeah.
So integrity, as I've said before, is tremendously important. We have to, but dispassion is critical. Keep politics out of history. When you start politicizing, when you do what Foucault says, is that Western culture is essentially to the bone evil. Right. Claim that's clearly false. We're politicizing history, and the only thing I'll add. The dangers you talked of, you wrote something you said on the 1619 thesis. It's important to understand, slavery, the importation of African Americans into the continents, and they weren't funneled to North America so much as they were to Central and South and the islands. But the point is, we also want the larger picture. We want to understand the entire complex, and we understand slavery over the millennia. Slavery, for example, was not just an issue of taking blacks from Africa to the New World. Slavery has been practiced for thousands of years. It continues to be practiced. If we try to make that into something that has happened only to one race, to the exclusion of others, we're failing to understand. Again, as I mentioned, people use the politics of power everywhere, in third world countries, in Europe of the Enlightenment. They use it in American politics. Russians use it. Even the Ukrainians who are being oppressed use power in their political arena, and so forth. So you need to keep that out. So I would say one of the dangerous trends is this complete focus on race. And I say that because I think that's a harmful trend. We're losing the big picture by focus. You're focusing so much on a detail. We're losing the big picture.
Right. And I've been able to, so far, so good. I've been able to detect when there's a narrative that doesn't have the best interest of history going
No integrity, no honesty.
by the author, by the historian. Well, I think there was one part of the first question with what is a historian, what are professional issues and ethical obligations of a historian, but I think you've answered that in
Honesty, integrity, and you know, and it's great that we're focusing today on these sort of marginalized, compartmentalized issues of race, but to focus on them to the exclusion of everything else. I'll say two things. One is, when I look at, you talk about how do you stay current. When I look at, type in Thomas Jefferson in the search engine, all you get Thomas Jefferson, slaveholder, racist. That's all Thomas Jefferson was. First off, I don't think he was a racist. He was a slave owner. A lot of people owned slaves. And secondly, when you focus, you know, when you politicize history like that, or you focus too narrowly on something, we lose a sense of really what was going on.
Right.
The philosopher Wittgenstein, I love this. He said, he talked about, I think it's on his work on certainty. He said, imagine looking at a painting, and you go to the painting and you go to it and you do this. Let me see what that, you put your face right into the painting. And then Wittgenstein says, no, that's not how you understand the painting. It's understood from a certain distance. Right? If you want to look too minutely, and he meant this for being too analytical. I don't think you can be too analytical, but you can be too focused on something. You start focusing on one particular issue to the exclusion of everything else, you lose a sense of what was going on at the time. That's what we're losing.
Yes.
We're losing that perspective. We're losing our perspective.
That's what bothers me, and it hurts to see. Well, my particular favorite time in history is the American Revolution and Declaration of Independence, and it really bothers me to see Thomas Jefferson discredited for everything wonderful he did for our country, because
you have a roach clip for my cigar?
No, I don't have one, Andy. But yeah, so talking about challenging, I did consider at one point, I put that to rest though, I did consider at one point, if time were not an issue, I'll use myself as an example with Thomas Jefferson because of the letter to Benjamin Rush. I took it as Thomas Jefferson was a devout Christian because he said he was a Christian.
That, didn't you?
Right, until I met you, and then you just killed my.
But he was a devout Christian.
Yeah.
He really was. He believed in Christ.
Right.
He believed Christ was a human being and only a human being, but he gave the most profound sense of morality that anyone in history of the world has. Is that not being a Christian?
Right.
I think that's quite beautiful. I mean, when I gave a lecture on Jefferson and religion one time at UVA, and you know, when I talked about his views, and you know, I said Jefferson, even though he sang hymns and prayed in churches at that time, he didn't think there was a God listening to that.
Right.
God created the world at one time and everything. He did it the right way. There's no need to intervene, and he's not going to sit back. But people were crushed by that. Well, that's not what I wanted to hear. That's not, you know, that's not the Thomas Jefferson I came to know and love. That he, in other words, he didn't think like I do. Well, is that my job to make him out to be someone you can embrace?
But no.
He was a lovely man. He, more than the people that sit in the pews and say their prayers and hymns, and this might sound offensive, he was a kind, loving, and good person who, throughout his life, put into play the very principles that Jesus preached. Love God, and he loved God through studying science, not by prayers, through studying what God created, and love your fellow human being. Now, what greater thing could you ask of any person? You know, didn't believe in an after, but what a wonderful thing, isn't it?
It is. Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book, American Messiah.
It's been in your library for what, 8 months now?
I'll probably cry. But
Remember, it's not your job to mold him into the person you want him to be. You might cry, you might find out crying because you really think, as I would, you really, when you find out what his views were, they were much more beautiful than you really thought.
yeah,
And you realize when what resonates to me when he says, I'm a Christian in the only sense in which, he wanted us to be. Yeah, I think he nailed it. I think he nailed it. I think understanding what the Christ that he understood is
mhm.
much better. I grew up Catholic and all that. I'm not very Catholic these days, not very religious, but I think his views on religion, the universe, he was a man profoundly in love with what God created.
Mhm.
What else could you say about loving your God than to love what he created? And he created humans too, to love other people.
Yes. So I guess he was what we had hoped. He is everything that I had hoped.
Well, you might come to disavow all that when you do further reading. You think, well, Holowchak didn't quite get it right, but okay.
Well, yeah, I considered challenging you. I considered, but time is not in my favor. So I have to put that to rest. Well, this concludes our show. And if you'd like to contact Dr. Holowchak for to be a guest speaker at your university or any of your organizations, you can contact him at mholowchak@hotmail.com or his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson, Bring Him Home to Monticello, Citizens for Change. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, Dr. Holowchak.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. It's kind of fun, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. This was very nice. I'm glad we got to talk about these topics and the issues with history today and what's important when you look at becoming a historian. And as the people that are listening, when they do their own research and to learn about history, use caution.
And we are the next 5 questions. One work is Jefferson's First Love.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we're a month off from
So those of
Valentine's.
you interested in Jefferson as a young man falling passionately in love with Rebecca Burwell, you won't want to miss that one. So we get Jefferson as a robustly emotional young man falls irretrievably in love. And we'll see what happens, what the eventuation of that little affair. I'll give you one hint. It didn't end in marriage because he married someone called Martha. Skeleton, so he didn't marry her.
But I think this will give us a chance to get to know his passion as a young man and his depth, the depth of his feelings. So I need to get prepared for that show. That'll be our 6th episode of One Work, 5 Questions. You can find us on YouTube. Look up One Work, 5 Questions. And we have 5 episodes and we're working on our 6th episode. So thank you everyone for joining us and have a wonderful weekend.
Signing off from my hermitage.
Yes, signing off from my hermitage.